She walked into his world with a blank check and the power to erase everything he had ever built. He walked into hers with nothing but a rejected check and the quiet dignity of a man who refused to be purchased. She was the most feared name in corporate America. He was a clockmaker who smelled like cedar and sawdust. She thought money could fix anything. He was about to prove her wrong. And somewhere between a rainy night, a child's Band-Aid, and a Nordic lullaby that haunted 15 years of her dreams, they would both discover that the most devastating collision is not between steel and stone. It is between two people who were never supposed to meet again. If this story already has your heart, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, stay until the very last word, and let us begin. The morning Victoria Sterling arrived in Emberwood, the sky was the color of polished steel. It was not a coincidence. People who worked inside the orbit of Obsidian Core Development Group had long stopped believing in coincidences where Victoria was concerned. When she moved, weather seemed to follow her lead. Cold fronts descended. Barometric pressure dropped. The air itself tightened as though the atmosphere understood that something immovable was about to be dislodged. She arrived in a black SUV with tinted windows flanked by two more identical vehicles, carrying lawyers, a project coordinator, and a man whose only job title, as far as anyone could tell, was to stand slightly behind Victoria and look expensive. Her personal assistant, a young woman named Claire, who had lasted 11 months in the role and was therefore considered a veteran, sat rigidly in the front passenger seat with a tablet pressed to her chest like a shield. 14 minutes behind schedule, Claire said carefully, not looking back. I know, Victoria said. The site foreman says the equipment is staged and ready. He just needs your confirmation to proceed. I know that too. The residents are... Claire paused, choosing her words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Present. Victoria looked out the window for the first time since they had crossed into the Emberwood district boundary. The neighborhood scrolled past in shades of amber and rust and deep burgundy. Old brick storefronts with hand-painted signs. A flower shop with buckets of dahlias crowding the doorway. A barber shop with a striped pole still spinning, hypnotic and cheerful, and completely indifferent to the machines that had gathered at the far end of the block. Children on front steps. Old men on folding chairs. A woman in a yellow apron who stood with her arms crossed in front of her bakery watching the SUV pass with an expression that was not fear. It was something steadier than fear. It was the particular calm of someone who had already decided they were not going anywhere. Victoria did not linger on the yellow apron woman. She pulled her attention back to the interior of the vehicle and straightened the cuff of her blazer. How many holdouts? 3 property owners have refused all offers. Legal says the eminent domain filing is 90 days from executable, but the board wants the site cleared before the quarterly report. The optics of a stalled project are a problem I am here to solve. Victoria reached for her phone, checked the screen, and replaced it in her jacket pocket. The holdouts. Give me the names. Claire scrolled. Marchetti's Bakery. Owner is 67, has lived on the premises since the building was her grandmother's. She turned down $240,000. The second is Hal Briggs, the shoe repair place on the corner. He says, and I am quoting directly from the legal team's notes here, that he would eat the check before he cashed it. And the third, a brief pause. Thorne & Son. Antique clock repair and woodworking. The owner is Elias Thorne, 34 years old. Widower. 1 child, a boy named Leo, age 7. Claire's voice remained professional, but something about the way she read those last 2 facts was slightly different, quieter. Mr. Thorne has declined 3 separate offers. The most recent was $480,000. He declined in person and asked our representative to, quote, please close the door on the way out. Victoria made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was a sound she made when something mildly surprised her, which did not happen often enough to warrant a more developed reaction. Pull up in front of Thorne & Son. The SUV stopped on a street that smelled even through the closed windows of sawdust and something sweet and resinous that Victoria could not immediately identify. She stepped out onto the sidewalk and stood for a moment, adjusting to the neighborhood, the way a person adjusts to a change in altitude. Everything in Emberwood felt slightly lower and wider and less vertical than the world she inhabited. The buildings had weight, they had age, they had the particular solidity of structures that had absorbed decades of ordinary human living and become through that absorption something more than their materials. Thorne and Son occupied a narrow two-story building between a bookbinder and a woman's clothing alteration shop. The ground floor windows were thick with history. Inside, visible through the old glass that distorted the light slightly, were clocks. Dozens of them. Hundreds, possibly. Grandfather clocks standing at attention like a congregation. Mantel clocks arranged on shelves with the careful spacing of a museum exhibition. Wall clocks overlapping each other like the scales of some strange, time-keeping creature. And among them, almost invisible until you looked directly at him, a man at a workbench bent over something small. He had not looked up. Victoria pushed open the door. The bell above it rang a bright, clear note, and every clock in the room seemed to inhale. The smell hit her the moment she crossed the threshold. Cedarwood, oil polish, something metallic and precise, and under all of it a warmth that had no logical source because the shop was not particularly warm, not by any measurable temperature, and yet the feeling of entering it was unmistakably the feeling of entering somewhere that had been loved for a very long time. The man at the workbench looked up. Elias Thorne had brown eyes the color of dark walnut, and he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who work with their hands at tasks requiring absolute precision. He was not a large man, but he had the kind of physical presence that comes not from size, but from certainty. He knew exactly where he was in the world. He knew exactly how much space he occupied. He was wearing a canvas apron over a dark flannel shirt, and there was a faint smudge of oil on his right forearm, and he looked at Victoria with an expression of polite, complete, and utterly unintimidated recognition. "Ms. Sterling," he said. He did not stand up. He set down the small tool he had been using carefully, the way you set down something irreplaceable. "I was wondering when you would come yourself." Victoria had walked into a great many rooms in her professional life and had never once felt that the room had the upper hand. She felt it now mildly and briefly, and she did not like it. "Then you know why I am here," she said. "The same reason 3 different representatives in increasingly expensive suits came before you." He reached under the workbench and produced a manila envelope, which he set on the corner of the bench without opening it. The difference is that they at least pretended to make it seem like a conversation. This is a conversation. You came with 2 lawyers, a coordinator, and whatever that man in the gray suit is. Risk management. Right. He looked at her steadily. That would be me then. The risk. Victoria moved further into the shop, and one of the lawyers behind her moved to follow. She held up 2 fingers without looking back, and both lawyers stopped at the threshold. She walked between the clocks. She did not touch anything, but she looked at everything because she was, despite herself, looking at everything. The shop was dense with time. Not the abstract conceptual time of quarterly reports and project timelines, but actual accumulated physical time. The weight of years in the grain of old oak. The patient repetition of gears that had been turning since before she was born. The walls were covered in photographs and hand-drawn sketches and framed newspaper clippings, and a child's crayon drawing slightly crooked of what appeared to be 2 stick figures standing next to something that was either a very tall clock or a tree. "You know what I am going to say," Victoria said. She stopped at a grandfather clock near the window. It was extraordinary. Solid mahogany hand-carved panels, a face that was painted, rather than printed, the numerals in a script that looked like calligraphy. It was ticking with a depth and resonance that she could feel slightly in her sternum. "I am going to say that I can make this transition comfortable for you and your son, that the offer I am prepared to make today is the kind of offer that does not come twice, that you are a reasonable man, and that reasonable men understand when they are in the path of something larger than themselves." Elias Thorne listened to all of this with his hands resting on the workbench. "And I am going to say," he replied with a courtesy so genuine it was almost disarming, "that this building was opened by my grandfather in 1951, that the clock you are standing next to was built by my father when he was 22 years old and repaired by me when I was 16 and then again when I was 29. That my son learned to count to 60 by watching that clock secondhand, and that my wife used to sit in that chair by the window when she was too tired to work but too stubborn to go upstairs, and I would bring her tea and she would watch the clocks and say they were the only things in the world that made her feel like time was actually her friend. He paused. History and memories don't have a barcode, Miss Sterling. You cannot scan them and produce a number. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. 480,000 is the current offer, she said. I came here prepared to go higher. I know you did. The neighborhood is going to change regardless. The district plan is filed. It is a matter of legal timing, not legal question. I know that too. Then what is it that you actually want, Mr. Thorne? Because in my experience, when someone refuses this much money, this many times, they either want more money or they want something money cannot buy, and I need to know which one it is. The shop was quiet, except for the clocks, all of them dozens of heartbeats in synchronized counterpoint. I want what is mine to stay mine, Elias said simply. I want my son to grow up on this street. I want Mrs. Marchetti to keep making sfogliatelle at 6 in the morning. I want Hal Briggs to fix the shoes of people who cannot afford to replace them. I want this neighborhood to keep being a place where people who are not rich can still have a life worth living. He looked at her directly. I don't think you can buy that, but I think you know exactly how to destroy it. Victoria opened her mouth to respond. What happened next happened in approximately 4 seconds, which is not enough time for even the most analytically disciplined mind to process all of its components in sequence. Later, she would reconstruct it in the way you reconstruct something that bypassed the conscious mind entirely and went straight to the body. First, a low grinding sound from the alley adjacent to the building where the excavation equipment had been edging forward in violation of the staged boundary. Second, a vibration subtle but wrong traveling through the floor. Third, the crack sharp and sudden of the old brick archway above the workshop's side door, giving way under the shifting pressure. And then Leo Thorne came running through that side door, 7 years old, carrying a paper bag, and calling Dad, Mrs. Marchetti sent cannoli, with the absolute focus of a child for whom cannoli was the most important thing in the world at that exact second. Elias moved before the dust settled. He crossed the shop in 4 strides and drove himself forward and down, arms wrapping around Leo, turning his body so that his own back took the fragment of falling plaster and brick that clipped his left arm as they went to the floor together. Leo yelped. The paper bag hit the ground and the cannoli rolled across the old floorboards in a direction that would have been comic in any other context. Victoria was already moving toward them, some pre-verbal reflex overriding the professional immobility she had cultivated for 15 years. Leo. Elias was saying low and steady, checking his son's face, his arms running his hands over the boy's head with the quiet efficiency of someone who knows how to stay calm when someone he loves is scared. Hey, look at me. You're okay. I have got you. Look at me. Leo was not crying, but he was making the high, thin, speechless sound of a child who was about 2 seconds away from crying. His eyes were very wide. There was a big noise, Leo said. I know. It is okay. Old buildings make big noises sometimes. You are not hurt. No. Leo blinked. The cannoli. We will get the cannoli. They are on the floor. I know. We will get them. Leo blinked again, and his gaze traveled past his father's shoulder to where Victoria was standing closer now than she had intended to be close enough to see the exact moment the boy processed her presence as a stranger in the shop. His chin wobbled once and then steadied because his father's arms were around him, and his father's voice was calm, and for Leo Thorne those two things were sufficient architecture for weathering most emergencies. Elias shifted slightly to check his own arm, and that was when his sleeve pulled back. The burn scar was on the inside of his left forearm, running from just above the wrist to the inside of the elbow. It was old silvery pink, a long-healed wound that had the smoothed and permanent look of something that had happened a long time ago and been lived with every day since. The shape of it was distinctive, almost like a flame line sideways, the widest point at the center tapering toward both ends. Victoria stopped breathing. It was not a conscious decision. Her respiratory system simply suspended itself for 3 full seconds, the way a record skips, the way a projector sticks on a single frame. Because she had seen that scar before. She had seen it from below in the dark, in the middle of a burning car, on a rain-slick highway when she was 19 years old, and the world was upside down and her mother was not making any sound anymore. And there was a stranger's hand reaching through the broken window, and she had grabbed that arm and felt the raised texture of old scar tissue under her fingers, and a voice had said, steady and close, "I have got you. You are going to be okay. I have got you." Elias looked at Leo and then began to do something so natural, so unconsciously reflex, that Victoria understood he did not even know he was doing it. He began to hum low and soft, almost under his breath, and then the hum shaped itself into something with a melody, and then the melody shaped itself into words sung very quietly in a language that was not English, the rhythm of them slow and rocking and impossibly devastatingly familiar. It was the lullaby, the Nordic lullaby, the one she had looked up twice in the years after the accident and never been able to find because she could only remember fragments and could never find the exact sequence of the notes. The one that had kept her conscious in the wreck while the stranger held her hand and the sirens got closer. The one that had played slightly distorted in the back of her skull in every nightmare she had ever had about fire and rain and her mother's silence. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice came out wrong. She heard it herself. It was not the voice she used in boardrooms or on construction sites or in the offices of men who were afraid of her. It was a smaller voice, unguarded, cracked at the edge like old porcelain. Elias looked up from his son. He looked at her face, and something in his expression shifted not dramatically, but in the way that light shifts when a cloud moves subtle and total. "Are you all right?" he asked. No one had asked her that in a very long time. Certainly not on a job site. Certainly not in a professional context. The question, delivered with the same quiet directness he used for everything else, bypassed every layer of professional insulation she had spent 15 years installing between herself and the world. Victoria Sterling, the heartless excavator. The iron-willed architect of 47 successful development projects. The woman whose name made city council members clear their calendars stood in a clockmaker's workshop with plaster dust on her blazer and looked at the burn scar on the arm of the man she was paid to displace. She had been 19 years old. She had been upside down in a burning car. She had grabbed that arm in the dark. She had heard that song. She had been pulled free of the wreckage by those hands, and she had never found the man who saved her. And she had stopped looking years ago because some debts feel too large to approach directly. She found him now, in the worst possible way. The lawyers were in the doorway asking something she could not hear. Outside, one of the bulldozers had stopped. Claire was on the phone. The world around the shop continued to operate on its normal schedule, indifferent to the fact that 15 years of unresolved history had just collapsed like old brick and settled quietly on the floor between two people who were standing very still. "I owe you something," Victoria said, because she was a woman who dealt in transactions, and this was the only framework she had for what was happening inside her chest. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his son, who had found a cannoli that had survived the impact and was regarding it with scientific scrutiny. "You do not owe me anything," Elias said. "You pulled me out of a burning car on Route 9 15 years ago, the accident at the intersection by the Halverson overpass. A woman died in the driver's seat." Her voice did not shake on this. She had practiced those words in therapy and in private and in the dark for a very long time. "You held my hand until the paramedics came and you sang to me so I would not lose consciousness. And when I got out of the hospital, you were gone and I never found you." The shop was very quiet. Leo looked up from the cannoli. "Dad saved somebody?" Leo asked. "Yes," Victoria said before Elias could speak. "He did." Elias looked at her with those dark walnut eyes, and she could see him placing her the way you place someone who is a stranger and remains a stranger and is also at the same time something else entirely, something for which the language of ordinary introduction is completely inadequate. "I remember that night," he said quietly. "I know you do. The scar. Yes. And the song. I have been trying to find that song for 15 years. Something crossed his face. Not pride, not sentimentality, just a kind of tired human recognition of the strange weights that life distributes without asking permission. He looked down at his arm and then back at her. My mother taught it to me, he said. It is very old. Most people have never heard it. I have never been able to forget it, she said. Leo, 7 years old and entirely practical, appeared at his father's side. He looked at the woman in the expensive blazer who had plaster on her shoulder and something strange and wet in her eyes, and he reached up and took his father's hand. Is she going to be okay? Leo asked his father with the directness of a child who does not yet know how to perform concern rather than simply feel it. Elias looked at Victoria. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Outside, one of the lawyers knocked on the doorframe. Ms. Sterling, the site foreman is asking about the equipment clearance. Victoria did not turn around. She stood in the middle of the shop, surrounded by clocks that had been keeping time for decades, in a neighborhood that had been living its quiet life before she was born, looking at the man who had once made himself a bridge between her and death when neither of them had agreed to know each other. The plaster dust was settling, the clocks were ticking, and something in Victoria Sterling that she had been maintaining and reinforcing and defending for 15 years developed for the first time a crack. The demolition equipment stayed silent for 3 days. No official order was issued. No memo circulated through the legal department. No press release explained the pause. The machinery simply sat at the edge of Emberwood like patient, rusting animals, their operators showing up each morning, drinking coffee from thermoses and waiting for a clearance signal that did not come. Claire fielded 4 calls from the site foreman in the first 24 hours and told him carefully that Ms. Sterling was reviewing the site assessment. The foreman, who had worked with Obsidian Core for 9 years, understood that this was the kind of answer that meant something had changed, but nobody was ready to say what yet. In her office on the 41st floor, Victoria sat with her hands flat on her desk and stared at the wall. The office was a monument to controlled aesthetics. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, the city spread below her like a circuit board. Furniture in pale ash and brushed steel. No photographs. No plants. The only decoration, if it could be called that, was a scale architectural model of the Emberwood corridor project in a glass case near the window, its miniature buildings clean and white and geometric, the tiny footprint of thorn and sun, absent from the model, entirely replaced by a smooth plaza surface. She had been staring at that model for a long time. The legal team had sent over the eminent domain timeline again, 90 days to an executable order assuming no new complications. The board had sent a satisfaction survey regarding the site visit, which was the corporate equivalent of asking how quickly she planned to finish. Her uncle Roland Sterling had left 2 voicemails, both in the smooth paternal register he used when he was most displeased, asking her to call him at her earliest convenience. Victoria did not call Roland. Instead, she picked up her phone and called the head of her private legal division, a man named Garrett, who had worked for the Sterling family for 20 years, and had the permanent expression of someone who was professionally accustomed to being the bearer of bad news. I need you to build something for me, she said before he could speak. A foundation, charitable structure, heritage preservation, something in that category. I need it to be completely clean, completely anonymous, completely untraceable to Obsidian Core or to me personally. A pause. What is the funding level? Victoria looked at the architectural model, at the smooth white plaza where the clock shop was not. 2 million. Another pause, this one longer. That is a significant figure for anonymous philanthropy. There is a child who needs surgical intervention for a hearing condition. I want that covered entirely best specialists in the country, no waiting, no insurance negotiation. The remainder goes into an endowment for the property owner to use at his discretion, preservation business continuity, whatever he chooses. She kept her voice level and precise, the way she kept her voice in every business conversation, because if she let it become anything other than level and precise, it would become something she was not prepared to manage in a professional context. I want it structured as a grant, a competitive heritage grant that he applies for and receives through normal channels. Nothing that looks like it came from a person who owes him something. Garrett was quiet for a moment. This is not a standard request. I am aware. The board will ask about the allocation. The board does not manage my private accounts. Victoria. He used her first name carefully, the way people used it when they were about to say something she did not want to hear. Is this related to the stalled demolition clearance? Build the foundation garret. Have the grant documents structured by Friday. She ended the call. She stood at the window for a long time after that, watching the city below where thousands of ordinary lives were proceeding with their ordinary urgency. And she thought about a 7-year-old boy who had asked his father if she was going to be okay. And she thought about the answer his father had given. And she thought about the fact that she had spent 15 years becoming a woman for whom that answer would always be the same, which was that she was fine. She was always fine. The project was on schedule, the numbers were clean, and everything was under control. The grant documents were ready by Thursday. By Friday morning, they had been submitted through the Heritage Preservation Fund, a pristine new nonprofit with a clean website and 3 board members who were retired academics with no visible connection to real estate development. The fund's inaugural grant went to Elias Thorne of Thorne and Son in Emberwood in recognition of outstanding contribution to the preservation of artisan craft traditions in urban neighborhoods. By Friday afternoon, Elias had called the number on the grant letter. By Friday evening, he had driven to the public library and used the computer terminal there to run the Heritage Preservation Fund through every nonprofit database and corporate registry tool he knew how to use, which was not nothing because Elias Thorne had spent 3 years before his son was born working as a legal aid, and he still knew how to read a corporate filing. It took him 4 hours. The shell was good. Garrett had done his job thoroughly. The foundation had clean incorporation documents, a legitimate tax status. 3 board members with real academic credentials and real published work in historic preservation. There was no obvious thread to pull. Elias pulled every thread anyway. He was methodical about it. He cross-referenced the nonprofit's registered address with the building's other tenants. He searched the names of the board members in conjunction with every professional organization conference and publication he could access. He looked at the fund's initial capitalization, which was filed as a private donation and not required to disclose its source, but which, when cross-referenced with the timing of Victoria Sterling's site visit and the subsequent 3-day silence of the demolition equipment, began to assemble itself into a shape that was not ultimately ambiguous. He drove home and put Leo to bed, and then he sat in the shop for a long time in the dark, surrounded by the clocks, all of them ticking, the sound of them filling the room, the way water fills a vessel, complete and patient and indifferent to what he was feeling. He was not angry yet. He identified this clearly the way he identified the components of a mechanism before deciding how to address them. He was not angry. He was something more specific than angry, something that had no single clean name but was composed of several recognizable elements. There was the particular bitterness of a man who has been treated as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be addressed. There was the sharper, more personal sting of realizing that the gesture, however generous in dollar terms, was designed to allow its giver to move on without having a real conversation. And there was something underneath both of those things quieter and more uncomfortable, which was the feeling of having misjudged someone and being not entirely sure yet what the correct judgment was. He went to bed at 2 in the morning and did not sleep well. By Monday, he had made his decision. He got up at 5:30, the same time he always got up, and he made coffee and packed Leo's lunch and sat with his son at the kitchen table while Leo ate cereal and narrated in considerable detail a dream he had had involving a dragon who collected clocks and traded them for different colored clouds. "That sounds like a good system," Elias said. "I think the dragon was lonely," Leo said with the casual profundity of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by insight. He had a lot of clocks, but nobody to tell him what time it was good to do things. Elias looked at his son for a moment. "That is a very smart thing to notice," he said. He dropped Leo at school, came back to the shop, put on his cleanest work shirt, the dark navy one with no oil stains in all its buttons, and his good jacket, the charcoal one he wore to school events, and the occasional neighborhood council meeting. He found the grant envelope in the drawer where he had put it. He put it in his inside jacket pocket. Then he went to the bank and withdrew the equivalent amount in a certified check, which took some paperwork and some patience and the attention of a bank manager who had known him for 8 years and did not ask questions, but watched him with a carefully neutral expression as the figure was processed. He took the bus to the financial district. He had been to the financial district before. It was not another planet. It was just another part of the same city, but it operated at a different register, a different volume, a different temperature. The buildings were taller and more certain of themselves. The sidewalks moved faster. The lobbies were vast and pale and acoustically engineered to produce a sense of scale that was functionally indistinguishable from intimidation. The lobby of Obsidian Core's headquarters was the best of its kind. 30 feet of Italian marble underfoot. A reception desk staffed by two people whose combined professional polish could have buffed a ship. Security stationed at intervals with the discreet efficiency of people who had been trained to stop you without making it look like stopping. Elias walked in like he belonged there because belonging somewhere in his experience had very little to do with the building and everything to do with the person. He walked the way he walked in his own shop with the same unhurried certainty, and it turned out that unhurried certainty was actually a fairly effective credential in a lobby full of people performing urgency. He reached the reception desk. "Elias Thorne," he said. "I am here to see Victoria Sterling." The receptionist looked at him with the practiced, pleasant blankness of someone who managed unexpected visitors for a living. "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Thorne?" "No. Ms. Sterling's schedule is—" "I understand," Elias said with perfect courtesy. "I will wait." He stepped to the side and stood near the marble wall and waited with the patience of a man who fixes clocks for a living and has therefore made peace in a very fundamental way with the fact that some things take the time they take. He waited for 22 minutes. He knew it was 22 minutes because there was a clock on the far wall, a large modern piece with no numerals, just minimalist hands. And he watched it the way he watched all clocks with the professional interest of a man who can hear the mechanism behind the face. Victoria appeared from the elevator bay rather than from upstairs, which meant someone had called ahead and she had made the choice to come down rather than summon him up, and he noted this without assigning it too much weight. She was in her office clothes, the armor of her professional world, the charcoal blazer and the structured posture, and the expression of complete composed control. But she stopped when she saw him, and something very brief and very unguarded crossed her face before the composure reassembled itself. "Mr. Thorne," she said. "Ms. Sterling." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the certified check. He held it for a moment, and the lobby light caught its surface, and then he stepped forward and placed it on the marble reception desk between them, with the same unhurried care with which he set down every irreplaceable thing. Victoria looked at the check. She looked at him. "The Heritage Preservation Fund, Chuck," he said, "is a Garrett-managed shell capitalized by a private donation made in the same week that your demolition equipment went quiet. The board members are real, but the timing, the dollar amount, and the administrative address all trace back indirectly but unambiguously to the same corporate infrastructure that has been trying to buy my shop for the past 3 months." He kept his voice even and conversational, as though he were explaining a mechanism to an interested customer. "I do not think you are a stupid woman. I think you did not expect me to look that hard. But I have spent my working life understanding how things fit together, and this fit together very clearly." Victoria was very still. "The grant was not a bribe, she said quietly, so that the receptionist and the security personnel and the 2 lawyers crossing the lobby at that moment would not hear the conversation become personal. "It was not a way to buy your silence or accelerate the demolition. It was." She stopped. Something moved across her face. "Leo's surgery, that was the only part of it that was not about the property. That was genuinely just. I wanted to make sure he was taken care of." "I know that," Elias said. "I believe that completely." "Then why?" "Because your money can buy silence, but it cannot buy dignity." He looked at her directly, without hostility, without performance, with the same clear and straightforward attention he gave to everything. "I am not a problem you can pay to resolve. My neighborhood is not a wound you can throw money at to stop the bleeding. The people on that street are not a line item in your conscience budget." He paused. "You saved her life, you owe him something, set up a fund, move on. That is not how this works. That is not how any of this works." Victoria looked at the check on the marble desk. $2 million. Her handwriting was not on it, but her hands had moved the pieces that put it in motion, and they both knew that. "Then what do you want from me?" she said. Not aggressively. She said it the way a person says something when they genuinely do not know the answer and have run out of the frameworks they usually use to produce one. I want you to be honest about what the project is doing and who it is doing it to, Elias said. I want the people in that neighborhood to be spoken to, not negotiated around. I want you to come back to Emberwood not with lawyers and risk managers, but as a person who is capable of understanding that what she is proposing to erase was built by people who are still alive and still living there. He picked up the check from the desk and held it out to her. And I want you to take this back. Because if Leo gets his surgery, it will be because I worked for it and saved for it and found a way to make it happen, not because someone wrote a check to clear her conscience and called it a grant. The lobby was quiet around them in the particular way that large spaces become quiet, when something is happening in them that the space was not designed for. Victoria looked at the check in his outstretched hand. She did not take it. The surgery fund, she said, just that part. I am not asking you to accept the rest, but let me do just that part. Not as a payment, not as a grant, not as anything that has a corporate name attached to it. Just as a person who understands that a 7-year-old boy should not wait 2 more years for a surgery that already exists. Her voice was very controlled, but it was the control of something under considerable pressure rather than something at rest. You can refuse everything else. You can send every other check back. But do not make him wait because of my mistakes. Elias looked at her for a long time. The clocks in his shop were not in this room, but he heard them anyway, the way you hear a sound that has become part of your internal architecture. That, he said finally, is the first honest thing you have said to me since you walked into my shop. Victoria said nothing. I will think about it, he said. He put the certified check back in his jacket pocket. He nodded once with the courtesy that was as natural to him as breathing, and he turned and walked back across the marble floor toward the revolving doors and the ordinary, imperfect, irreplaceable world outside. Victoria stood at her reception desk and watched him go. The 2 receptionists were examining their screens with extraordinary focus. The security guard near the elevator was very interested in his shoes. Claire appeared at Victoria's elbow with a tablet and the expression of someone who had witnessed the last 4 minutes and was professionally committed to not having done so. The board called again, Claire said. I know. Your uncle left another message. I know. The site foreman is asking about the weekly status report. Tell him the assessment is ongoing, Victoria said. She picked up the grant envelope that Elias had also left on the desk, the original one from the Heritage Preservation Fund still sealed. Returned the same way the check had been returned, intact and unanswered. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Somewhere across the city, in a narrow shop between a bookbinder and an alterations tailor surrounded by the steady breathing of several hundred clocks. The man who had once pulled her out of a burning car was probably back at his workbench by now, his jacket back on its hook, his hands already moving over something small and intricate and real. Victoria put the envelope in her jacket pocket next to nothing because there was nothing there that matched it. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the 41st floor. The doors opened. The doors closed. The city dropped away beneath her as she rose. And the question he had asked her, not aggressively, not with accusation, but with the simple directness of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, stayed with her in the elevator, and then in her office, and then later through a board call she barely heard, and a dinner she did not eat well into the long, restless night. What do you want from me? She did not have an answer yet. But for the first time in a very long time, the absence of an answer felt less like a problem to be solved and more like a door she had not yet found the right way to open. The question lived in her office for 2 weeks. It did not announce itself every morning. It did not sit visibly on her desk beside the architectural models and the quarterly projections and the stack of folders that Claire replenished with the dedicated efficiency of someone who understood that Victoria's relationship with paperwork was one of the more stable relationships in her life. It was quieter than that. It appeared in the margins of her attention in the 3 seconds of stillness between ending one phone call and beginning the next in the elevator rides she no longer used to review emails on her phone. In the mornings when she stood at her apartment window with her coffee going cold and watched the city wake up below her and thought with an uncomfortable clarity, She could not switch off about a narrow street in Emberwood where a light was probably already on in a woodshop. The board pressure did not pause to accommodate her internal recalibration. Roland Sterling called 3 more times in the second week. Her uncle had a voice built for boardrooms deep and resonant, and seasoned with just enough warmth to suggest approachability while communicating its total absence. He left voicemails that were in their way. Masterworks of indirect threat, each one phrased as concern, as family loyalty, as the reasonable worry of a man who had watched the Sterling Empire grow from its foundations and simply could not understand why his brilliant niece seemed to be allowing sentiment to compromise her professional judgment. The quarterly report goes to shareholders in 18 days, but, his last message said, the Emberwood corridor is listed as an active site. If it is not active, we have a disclosure problem. I am sure you understand, Victoria. Call me. She did not call him. Instead, she worked. She worked the way she had always worked when the pressure reached a certain threshold, which was without stopping, without sleeping adequately, without eating at hours that corresponded to any recognizable meal schedule. She arrived at the office at 6 and left after midnight and sat in the back of the car on the way home reviewing documents on her tablet while the city moved past the windows in streaks of light, and she failed repeatedly and completely to feel anything about any of it except tired. The insomnia had been a companion for years. It was not new, but it had been for most of her professional life a manageable companion, the kind of chronic condition you develop a working relationship with. Finding the 2 or 3 hours of genuine sleep somewhere in the early morning and building the rest of the day around the deficit. Now it shifted into something more aggressive. She would lie in her apartment, which was all pale surfaces and engineered silence and the faint hum of the climate control system, and the silence would feel less like peace and more like a room she was locked in. She thought about sawdust. She could not explain this. She thought about the smell of cedarwood and oil polish and old clock mechanisms. She thought about the ticking that layered multi-voice ticking that had surrounded her in the shop and which was nothing like the single sharp note of the minimalist clock in her office lobby, which told time but did not feel like time. She was losing weight she did not have to lose. Claire noticed and said nothing, which was its own kind of notification. On a Tuesday night in the 3rd week, Roland sent an email rather than a voicemail, which meant the politeness was ending. The email copied 3 board members and the company's primary legal counsel, and it used the phrase fiduciary responsibility twice, which was the corporate equivalent of a drawn weapon. Victoria read it in the back of the car going home at 11:30. The rain had started somewhere around 9 and had settled into the kind of extended committed downpour that made the city look like it was being slowly rinsed of something. The streets reflected the headlights in long, fractured smears of gold and red. She told the driver to take the long route. She could not have explained why. She was exhausted enough that her reasoning faculties were operating on reduced power like a building after hours, with only the emergency lighting on, and the decision to take the long route came from somewhere below reasoning entirely. Her body perhaps navigating by some older system than the one she normally trusted. The long route went through Emberwood. She was not aware of having directed this. The driver knew her preferences from months of the same routes, and the long route was simply the long route, and it happened to go through the eastern edge of Emberwood the same way it always had past the bakery and the barber shop and the altered clothing store and the narrow 2-story building between the bookbinder and the alterations tailor. There was a light on in the wood shop. It was late enough that this was not entirely expected, and she noticed it the way you notice a lit window at midnight in a dark street with a small involuntary lift of attention. She could see from the car the shape of someone at the workbench inside, bent over something in the warm, particular light of a working lamp. She told the driver to stop. She sat in the car for a moment in the rain. Then she got out. She was wearing the wrong shoes for rain. She was wearing the wrong everything for rain, but particularly the shoes, which were Italian leather, with a low heel and a silhouette that belonged in a boardroom, and had no structural relationship whatsoever with wet cobblestones in a downpour. She had no umbrella. She had not thought about an umbrella because she had not planned to be outside, and by the time she was outside, the rain was already soaking through her jacket with the efficient totality of water that has been falling long enough to mean business. She told the driver she would call him, and then she was standing on the sidewalk in front of Thorn and Son in the dark and the rain, and she did not entirely know why. There was a narrow awning over the shop door. It was old canvas slightly bowed in the middle, where rainwater had pooled and was dripping off the front edge in a curtain of drops. But the shelter it provided was real, and Victoria stepped under it more by reflex than decision, the way an animal seeks cover without planning, without deliberation, just the simple urgent priority of being somewhere slightly less wet. She stood under the awning for a moment. The rain hit the canvas above her with a sound that was surprisingly gentle, given the volume of water involved, a continuous soft percussion that was nothing like the engineered silence of her apartment and nothing like the controlled ambient noise of her office. But was she recognized with a surprise she did not have the energy to manage properly? Extremely calming. Her feet were hurting. She looked down and registered that her heels had been rubbing against the unpadded backs of her shoes long enough that the skin had broken. She had not noticed this happening. She had been in meetings and on calls and in cars and in elevators all day and had not noticed that she was bleeding inside her shoes. She was so tired. This was not the ordinary tiredness of overwork, although it was that too. It was the deeper tiredness of a person who had been performing a role with total dedication for so long that the performance had become indistinguishable from the person, and who was only now standing alone in the rain at midnight outside a shop she had no legitimate reason to be at, beginning to register the weight of what that cost. She did not sit down. She stayed standing because sitting down on the step of a man's shop uninvited felt like a different order of intrusion than simply sheltering under his awning. She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe and closed her eyes and listened to the rain. She was asleep within 4 minutes. She did not know this was going to happen. One moment she was listening to the rain with her eyes closed, and the next moment the rain was a different sound, softer. And she was not standing. She was somewhere between standing and not, her shoulder against the doorframe, taking more of her weight than she had intended to give it. The door opened. She startled fully awake, which produced the particular desperate alertness of someone jerked out of the first real sleep they have found in weeks, and she grabbed the doorframe and straightened and looked at the man in the doorway with an expression that she was quite certain from the inside was absolutely mortifying. Elias Thorne looked at her. He was still in his work clothes, the canvas apron, the flannel shirt, the oil-darkened hands of a man who had been working late. He was holding a cup of coffee, and he had clearly come to the door for some other reason, checking the weather perhaps, or locking up, and had found instead a soaking wet woman in a ruined blazer asleep against his doorframe. The expression on his face was not amusement, though there was an element of that. It was not annoyance. It was a kind of surprised, careful concern, the expression of a man who finds something unexpected and takes a moment to understand what it is before deciding how to respond to it. "Ms. Sterling," he said. "I was." She stopped. She was aware that there was no sentence she could complete that would make the situation professionally coherent. "My car. I had a flat tire." They both looked at the street where her car was very visibly present and intact, its driver reading something on his phone under the glow of the interior light. Elias looked back at her. "I meant to call him," she said. "I lost track of time." A pause. "You are soaked," he said. "Yes." "Your feet are bleeding." She looked down. The rain had washed the blood into a pale pink smear across the top of her right shoe. "They're fine." "They are not fine." He stepped back and held the door open. "Come in." "I do not want to impose." "You are sleeping on my doorstep in the rain," he said with a gentleness that somehow made this more rather than less difficult to hear. "That ship has sailed." She came inside. The shop at midnight was different from the shop in the afternoon. The overhead lights were off, and only the work lamps were on pools of warm amber light scattered across the benches, and the clock faces and the clocks themselves were in their nighttime register, the ticking softer somehow, or maybe just more audible in the absence of other sound. The smell of the shop, the cedarwood and the oil polish and the faint sweetness of the old wood surrounded her immediately, and something in her chest, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, released slightly, as though the smell were a key and the tightness were a lock, and the mechanism had just turned. Elias did not ask her questions. He set his coffee on the workbench and disappeared through the door at the back of the shop and came back carrying a wooden basin and a clean towel. He set the basin on the floor near the wide armchair by the window, the one she had noticed on her first visit, the chair with the worn armrests and the faded cushion. He filled the basin from a kettle that had been sitting on a small burner in the corner, and he added something from a jar ginger root, she thought, and salt, and the steam that rose from the water smelled medicinal and warm, and nothing like anything in her world. "Sit," he said, the way you say, sit to someone who is visibly on the edge of falling down. She sat in the armchair. She slipped off her ruined shoes, which was a relief so immediate it was almost violent, and she put her feet in the basin, and the warmth went up through her legs and into the rest of her body like a tide coming in. She said nothing. He said nothing. He went back to his workbench and picked up whatever he had been working on before she arrived. Something small, a clock movement, she thought, and the soft, precise sounds of him working joined the ticking and the rain outside and the steam from the basin, and all of it together composed a silence that was not a silence at all, but was more full and more restful than anything she had experienced in recent memory. A door opened somewhere upstairs, small feet on the wooden stairs. Leo appeared in the doorway to the back room wearing pajamas with rockets on them, his hair flattened on one side from the pillow, rubbing one eye with the focused inefficiency of a child who is not entirely awake but has been summoned by some instinct that overrode sleep. He looked at his father. He looked at the woman in the armchair with her feet in the basin. He processed this information with the unhurried thoroughness of a 7-year-old for whom the world was still a place where unusual things could appear without necessarily being alarming. "It is the lady from the shop," he said. "Yes," Elias said. "She got caught in the rain." "Oh." Leo considered this. Did she not have an umbrella? Apparently not. "We have an extra one. It is in the closet. It has ducks on it. I will let her know." Leo disappeared briefly and returned carrying a mug of warm milk, both hands wrapped around it, with the ceremonial care of a child transporting something precious. He crossed the shop and held it out to her, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone performing a very serious act of hospitality. Victoria took the mug. The warmth of it moved through her hands. "Thank you," she said. Leo looked at her face for a moment with the frank, uncomplicated scrutiny of a child who has not yet learned to look away from things. "You have a frown line," he said, pointing at the space between her eyebrows with one small finger. "Right there. Dad says people who frown a lot are just hurting inside." Victoria looked at him. "Your dad says a lot of true things," she said. Leo appeared to find this a satisfactory exchange. He reached into the pocket of his pajamas and produced something, a Band-Aid, the kind with cartoon superheroes on it, blue and red and slightly crumpled from having been carried in a pocket for an indeterminate period of time. He crouched down by the basin with the gravity of a field medic and peeled the backing off the Band-Aid and applied it with great precision to the blister on her right heel. "There," he said, satisfied. Victoria looked at the Band-Aid on her heel. She looked at the boy. She looked at the Band-Aid again. She did not cry. She was not generally a person who cried, and she was not going to become one in a clock shop at midnight while a 7-year-old in rocket pajamas stood by, ready to offer further medical assistance. But something happened in her face that she could not entirely control. A softening, a brief and involuntary lowering of all the structures she maintained between herself and anything that felt too much like being taken care of. Leo said goodnight with great formality and went back upstairs. The shop settled back into its nighttime rhythm. The rain continued. The clocks ticked. Elias worked. Victoria sat in the armchair with the mug of warm milk and the duck umbrella that Leo had retrieved from the closet and placed next to her chair before going to bed, and the warmth of the water worked its way through her feet and her legs and her spine, and the smell of the shop worked its way into her breathing, and somewhere between 1 minute and the next she was asleep again. This time it was not the thin, fragile, easily broken sleep of her usual nights. It was the deep, complete, dreamless sleep of a person whose body has made a unilateral decision and is enforcing it without negotiation. The kind of sleep that has weight and texture and depth. The kind that leaves you when you surface from it feeling as though you have been somewhere very far away and very necessary. She woke when the quality of the light changed. The rain had stopped. The windows were pale with the first gray of dawn, the particular fragile light of early morning that exists for about 20 minutes before the day properly begins. The clocks were still ticking, all of them, dozens of quiet heartbeats in the still air. There was a blanket over her. It was wool slightly worn, and it smelled of sun and cedar. And time, the smell of something that had been washed and dried on a line outdoors many times, and had absorbed that particular clean warmth into its fibers. It smelled like a home. She did not move for a moment. She lay in the chair under the blanket in the early light and listened to the clocks, and felt with a clarity that was new enough to be startling the shape of her own exhaustion, not as a condition to be managed, but as a wound that had been quietly and continuously bleeding for a very long time. Elias was at his workbench. He had his back to her, and he was doing something with a small mechanism, the precise, unhurried movements of a man doing something he knows how to do completely. There was a cup of coffee beside him, a fresh one still steaming. There was also a cup on the small table next to the armchair. She looked at it. It was coffee dark, no milk, as though he had observed at some point what she drank and filed it away without comment. She sat up slowly. The blanket settled around her. She reached for the coffee. Elias turned from his workbench, not startled, as though he had known the precise moment she woke. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." Her voice had the rough, unguarded quality of a person who has not yet reassembled their professional register. She did not try to assemble it. "I'm sorry. I did not mean to stay all night." "I know you did not. I should go." "You should drink your coffee first." She drank her coffee. It was very good. The kind of coffee made by someone who paid attention to the process, and she drank it slowly in the growing dawn light, while the city outside began its daily reassembly of noise and motion, and neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say to each other, but the silence of two people who were for the first time in the same room without an argument between them. "The blanket," she said finally. "My wife's. She would have wanted someone to use it." Victoria held the edge of the blanket for a moment. She thought about the woman who had sat in this chair and watched the clocks, and said they made her feel like time was her friend. She thought about what it meant to leave something that still carried warmth. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Victoria said. "She was ordinary," Elias said, and the way he said it made ordinary sound like the highest possible praise. She was genuinely beautifully ordinary. She liked bad television and good cheese and the way the shop smelled on rainy days. She made Leo a different pancake shape every Sunday morning. She was not spectacular in any way the world would notice. He was quiet for a moment. "I have noticed every day since she has been gone." Victoria set down her coffee cup. Outside, a car moved through the wet street, and the sound of it was soft and distant, and the day was beginning its ordinary operations. And in a clock shop in Emberwood, the ice that had been building for 15 years was not melting. All at once, it was not dramatic. It was not a flood. It was more like the first light hitting a frozen window, the frost becoming transparent, the world outside becoming by degrees visible again. "I do not know how to be a person in a place like this," Victoria said. She was not looking for a response. She was saying something true out loud, perhaps for the first time in the only place that had felt safe enough to say it. "I know how to be useful. I know how to be effective. I know how to walk into a room and have it reorganize itself around what I need. But this," she gestured a small, uncertain movement that encompassed the shop and the clocks and the blanket and the Band-Aid still on her heel. "I do not have a framework for this." Elias looked at her for a long, steady moment. "You do not need a framework," he said. "You just need to sit still long enough to remember that you are a person." Victoria looked at him. The clocks ticked. She stayed for another hour. She helped Leo eat breakfast, or more precisely, she sat at the kitchen table while Leo ate cereal and explained to her with great thoroughness the entire taxonomy of his favorite superheroes and their respective rankings on a scale of both power and moral reliability, which he appeared to have given considerable independent thought. She did not contribute much to this conversation, but she listened to all of it, and something about listening to a 7-year-old's completely earnest assessment of fictional heroes in the morning light of a kitchen that smelled like toast and coffee was she would not find the words for this for a long time, deeply and specifically restorative. She called her driver. She put on her ruined shoes and her dried jacket, and she picked up the duck umbrella and then put it back because it was not raining anymore. At the door, she stopped. "The surgery?" she said without turning around. "The fund without the corporate structure, just as a person, not as a company, if that is still something you would consider." A long moment. "Let me think about it," Elias said. She nodded. She stepped out into the morning. The street was washed clean by the rain, the cobblestones dark and gleaming, the air carrying that particular freshness that belongs to the hour after a storm when everything smells new and the light is at its most honest. Victoria walked to the car with her ruined shoes and her band-aided heel and the borrowed warmth of a wool blanket she was no longer wearing but could still feel, and she got in, and she did not reach for her phone, and she sat quietly as the car moved through the morning streets. And she thought about nothing at all, and it was the most peaceful 4 minutes she had experienced in longer than she could accurately calculate. She did not have a framework for what was happening to her, but for the first time in 15 years she was not entirely sure she needed one. The days that followed the rainy night were not a transformation. They were something slower and more honest than that. Victoria did not suddenly become a different person. She did not arrive at work humming or start keeping plants on her desk or begin treating the board meetings as opportunities for genuine human connection. She was still Victoria Sterling. She still walked into rooms and had them reorganize around her. She still read contracts the way a surgeon reads anatomy, with absolute precision and zero sentiment. She still arrived before anyone else and left after everyone except the cleaning staff. But something in the internal architecture had shifted. It was not visible from the outside, not to anyone except possibly Claire, who had been watching Victoria with the careful peripheral attention of a person whose professional survival depended on accurately reading atmospheric changes, and who began quietly to schedule 15-minute gaps in the morning calendar that she described as administrative review time, and which were in practice empty. Victoria used them to sit by her window with her coffee and do nothing. This was more radical than it sounds. She went back to Emberwood twice in the following 10 days. Not with lawyers, not with a project agenda. Once on a Saturday morning, when she parked the car 2 blocks away and walked through the neighborhood on foot without purpose, the way a person walks when they are trying to understand a place rather than assess it. She bought coffee from a cart near the barber shop and drank it standing on the sidewalk watching an old man play chess against himself on a folding table outside the bookbinder. She walked past Thorn and Son and did not go in because going in felt like it required a reason, and she did not have a reason, only a pull that she was not yet ready to name. The second time was a Wednesday afternoon, and she did have a reason, that time o'clock. One of the antique pieces in her office, a small carriage clock she had inherited from her mother and kept on her desk for 15 years without ever really looking at it, had stopped. It had been stopping intermittently for months, and she had been meaning to have it serviced and had not, and she picked it up from her desk on Wednesday afternoon and put it in her bag and drove to Emberwood. Elias turned it over in his hands with the focused, gentle attention he gave everything. He did not comment on the fact that she had brought it to him rather than to any of the several reputable clock repair services that existed in the city. He opened the back panel with a small tool and looked at the mechanism and made the small considering sound of a man diagnosing something he already understands. "The mainspring," he said. "It is fatigued. It has been running under tension for too long without being relieved." She looked at the clock and then at him. "I did not say anything," he said, but the corner of his mouth moved. He worked on the clock while she sat in the armchair by the window. The same armchair, the one with the worn armrests, and Leo came in from school and dropped his backpack by the door and narrated his entire day in the compressed and emphatic style of a child for whom every detail carried equal dramatic weight. A spelling test he had aced, a dispute on the playground about the rules of a game he described at length, a caterpillar he had observed on the fence at recess and about which he had developed significant questions regarding its future plans. "Where's it going to go when it becomes a butterfly?" Leo asked, directing this at Victoria, with the confidence of someone who has identified the adult in the room most likely to engage seriously with entomological career planning. "Wherever it wants, so," Victoria said. "That is rather the point of becoming a butterfly." Leo appeared to find this deeply satisfactory. He took an apple from a bowl on the workbench, bit into it with enormous authority, and went upstairs to do his homework. Victoria watched him go. "He asked me last week," Elias said, not looking up from the clock, "whether you were going to come back." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I did not know." "What did he say?" "He said you seemed like someone who was trying to figure out where she was going." Elias set down his tool and looked at the mechanism with the particular satisfaction of a man who has identified the exact nature of a problem. He has good instincts for a 7-year-old. Victoria looked at the clock face, its hands still waiting. "I called a specialist," she said, "about the surgery. Not through a fund, not through a corporate structure. Through my own physician as a personal referral. The doctor is very good. He has done this procedure 400 times. The waiting list is 8 months, but there is a cancellation slot in 6 weeks. She kept her eyes on the clock. "I'm not asking you to accept anything except the information. What you do with it is your decision." A long quiet. "What is the doctor's name?" Elias said. "Harmon. David Harmon at University Medical. He is the best in the country for pediatric auditory reconstruction." Another quiet. This one different, heavier the kind that comes when a proud man is making peace with something that costs him something real. "I will call him," Elias said. "Okay." He picked up his tool again. The clock began slowly, tentatively to tick. This was the shape of the 10 days that followed the rainy night. Small, real, incremental. Nothing declared. Nothing rushed. 2 people learning in the oldest and simplest way, which was by being in the same room together repeatedly and seeing what happened, that the space between them had changed from a contested territory into something neither of them had a ready word for. Roland Sterling noticed the change before Victoria was ready for him to notice it. He called her into his private office on a Thursday morning, which was unusual because Roland preferred to conduct his more delicate maneuverings over meals, where the social architecture of food and wine could be used to soften the edges of what he was actually saying. A private office meeting behind a closed door meant he had decided to dispense with softening. Roland Sterling was 61 years old and had the physical confidence of a man who had never once stood in a room where he did not believe he was the most important person present. He was silver-haired and broadly built, and he wore his authority the way he wore his suits so naturally it looked like he had been born in it. He had been Victoria's father's business partner before he was her uncle by marriage, and when Victoria's parents died, Roland had taken her in with the smooth efficiency of a man who recognized a valuable asset and understood the importance of maintaining it. He had raised her to be excellent. She gave him that. He had also raised her to be useful to Obsidian Core, and she gave him that too, and she had spent a long time not examining the difference between those two things too closely. "Sit down, Victoria," he said. She sat. "The Emberwood corridor set," he said without preamble. 18 days past the original clearance deadline. The quarterly report goes out in 4 days. I have been patient." "You have," she agreed. "I want to understand what is happening." He folded his hands on the desk. "Is there a legal complication I am not aware of?" "No." "A new environmental assessment?" "No." "Then what is causing the delay?" Victoria looked at her uncle. She had been looking at this face her entire adult life, had read it across dinner tables and boardroom tables and the long polished table in his private office, and she knew every register of it. She knew the warmth he deployed strategically, and the coolness underneath it, and the precise point at which the warmth became unavailable. She was at that point now. "I am reconsidering the scope of the project," she said. "There are legal and reputational frameworks around heritage designation that the current plan does not adequately account for. If we proceed without addressing them, we expose the company to a class of long-term liability that the short-term development gain does not justify." This was true in the way that many things she said were true, which was that it was factually accurate and also not the whole story. Roland looked at her for a long moment. "Is this about the clockmaker?" he said. The office was very quiet. "The project scope is the issue," she said. "Victoria." He used her name the way he used it when he wanted to suggest that he was seeing through something and that she should not embarrass herself by continuing to maintain it. "I have been in this business for 35 years. I know what a stalled project looks like, and I know what it smells like. This smells like sentiment. He paused. I also know who Elias Thorne is. I know about the accident. I had our people look into it after your first site visit. She went very still. You investigated him. I investigated the complication. That is my job. He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable men doing reasonable things. I understand that there is a personal history. I understand that it creates a feeling of obligation. But Victoria, you are the CEO of a publicly traded development company. You do not have the luxury of personal history when it conflicts with fiduciary obligation. The shareholders do not care that this man once pulled you out of a ditch. He pulled me out of a burning car, she said. Her voice was very flat and very clear. My mother was in that car. She did not get out. Roland absorbed this with the facility of a man who was very good at absorbing things that were inconvenient. I know, he said gently, which was worse than if he had said it without gentleness. And I am sorry for that. I have always been sorry for that. But your mother would have understood as your father understood that the business comes first. The business is what keeps everything else possible. Victoria looked at her uncle. I will have a revised project scope to the board by Monday, she said, with full legal documentation. Good. He nodded, satisfied, the warmth returning to his voice now that he believed the direction had been corrected. That is all I needed to hear. She left his office. She took the elevator to her own floor and walked past Claire and closed her office door and stood at the window for a long time looking at the city, and she thought about what her uncle had just told her, which was that he had investigated Elias, which meant he had the information, which meant he had the leverage, which meant that the quiet pause she had been managing so carefully was not actually a pause at all. It was a window, and the window was closing. She did not know yet exactly what Roland would do with what he had, but she had worked alongside him for 15 years, and she knew the way he operated with the same precision with which she knew a corporate filing or a legal mechanism, and what she knew was this. Roland Sterling did not investigate things he was not prepared to use, and he used things at the moment of maximum effect, which was not in a private meeting where he could be contradicted, but in a public context where the damage was already done before anyone could respond. She was right about all of it. She was only wrong about the timing. She thought she had until Monday. She had until Thursday night. At 11:47 Thursday evening, Victoria's phone began producing the particular rapid cascade of notifications that meant something was happening at a volume and speed that had gotten past the filters. She picked it up from the nightstand, and the first thing she saw was a news alert, a real estate industry publication with a headline about Obsidian Core's Emberwood corridor, and the second thing she saw was a text from Garrett that said, "Simply call me now." And the third thing she saw was a missed call from Claire at 11:30, which Claire never did. Claire did not call after 11. Claire respected the boundaries of the working day with a devotion that bordered on religious. She called Claire. "What happened?" Victoria said before Claire could speak. "The equipment." Claire's voice had the tight, precise quality of someone delivering information they have been holding carefully since the moment they received it. "The site manager got a direct authorization at 11:15, not from your office, from the board chairman's executive account. The equipment is moving into Emberwood now." A pause. "There is something else." "Tell me." Someone sent an email to the Emberwood Neighborhood Association from an anonymous account, but the information in it is very specific. It identifies you by name as the CEO, gives the full history of the acquisition attempts, the shell fund, the eminent domain timeline. It includes another pause, smaller and more careful. It includes information about the accident 15 years ago, your mother, the connection to Elias Thorne, the surgery fund, all of it. Victoria was already out of bed and moving toward her closet. "Who sent it?" she said, though she already knew. "We cannot trace the account directly, but it was sent at 11:18, 3 minutes after the equipment authorization from Roland's office. She was dressed in 4 minutes. She was in the car in 6. She told the driver Emberwood, and then she called Garrett and told him to start pulling every financial record related to Roland Sterling's personal accounts and the board chairman's discretionary fund and the 3 offshore holding companies she had identified 2 years ago and never pursued because she had believed with the particular blindness of someone who wants to believe something that Roland was ruthless but not corrupt. She had been wrong about that. The drive to Emberwood took 14 minutes. She was on the phone for all of them, and by the time the car turned onto the street, she had confirmation from Garrett that the equipment authorization had been issued with a board signature that had been obtained through a procedural irregularity, a quorum vote conducted via email at 10:45 at night, which was not illegal in a strict technical sense, but was the kind of move you made when you needed something done before someone could stop you. She heard the machines before she saw them. The sound of heavy equipment at midnight is a distinctive and brutal thing. The low diesel groan and the mechanical grind of something very large moving through space that was not designed for it. It was coming from 2 blocks north from the edge of the corridor where the demolition had been staged for weeks. She could see the lights, the white-yellow work lights mounted on the equipment, turning the night into something harsh and industrial. She got out of the car and walked toward the lights. The street had people in it. This surprised her for half a second before she understood that it should not. Of course the street had people in it. This was a neighborhood where people knew each other and cared about what happened to each other, and 11:47 on a Thursday night was not so late that word could not travel from the neighborhood association email to a phone to a front door to a street. There were 20 people then, 30 standing on the sidewalk watching the machines work at the northern edge of the corridor, a building that had been a community meeting hall and which was now in the harsh white light something being unmade. Victoria moved through the crowd looking for one face. She found him at the front. Elias was standing on the sidewalk with his hands in the pockets of a jacket he had clearly put on over his work clothes in a hurry because the collar of the flannel shirt was visible above the jacket zip, and he was watching the machines with an expression that was not the anger she might have expected, and not the grief she might have expected either. It was colder than both of those things. It was the expression of a man who has been proven right about something he desperately wanted to be wrong about. He heard her come up beside him. He knew who it was without looking. She could tell by the way he went slightly more still. "Elias," she said. He turned. She had been preparing something to say, not a speech, but at least a sentence, at least some ordered sequence of words that would begin to address the magnitude of what was happening. But when she looked at his face, she understood that there was no sentence adequate to this moment, and that trying to produce one would be the worst thing she could do. The expression on his face was not rage. Rage she could have worked with. This was something quieter and more final. This was the look of a man who has opened a door and found exactly what the most cynical part of him had always feared was on the other side, and who is now in the process of closing that door very carefully. "They emailed the neighborhood association," he said. "Everything, who you are, what you have been trying to do, the fund." A pause. "The accident, Leo's surgery. I know, my uncle. Your company. His decision, not mine. I did not authorize this. The equipment movement used a procedural maneuver to bypass my office. Roland orchestrated this while I was." She stopped. "While she was sleeping. While she was for the first time in years not watching because she had begun stupidly and vulnerably and against every professional instinct to trust that the pause she had created was stable. "You are the CEO," Elias said. "Yes. Your name is on every filing. Your signature is on every offer letter that came to my shop. Every representative who came to my door came because of you." He was not raising his voice. He was speaking with the same quiet steadiness he used for everything, and it was so much worse than shouting. "I know you did not call those machines tonight. I am not a fool. But I also know that the machine that has been pointed at this neighborhood for the past 6 months has your name on it. And I let myself." He stopped. He looked at the work lights reflecting off the windows of the meeting hall, the walls beginning to separate from themselves. "I let Leo talk to you at breakfast. Elias, he asked me this morning if you were going to come back on Saturday." His voice for the first time shifted from steady to something that was working to remain steady. "He wanted to show you the caterpillar cocoon he found on the fence. He has been checking it every morning." Victoria stood in the cold street with the machine noise and the work lights and the crowd around them and felt something in her chest perform a precise and devastating collapse. "I'm going to fix this," she said. He looked at her. Not with hope, not with the open receptivity she had been encountering in this face for the past 2 weeks. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on that very first day, with the polite, complete, utterly unintimidated recognition of a man who has already taken the measure of something and is not going to be persuaded otherwise by a promise. He put his arm around Leo, who had appeared beside him at some point, who was standing very close to his father's side watching the lights. He did not tell her to leave. He did not need to. He simply turned back to watch what was being taken apart, and the gesture of it, the simple act of turning away, was more complete than any dismissal she had ever received in a boardroom in her professional life. Victoria stood in the street for another moment. Then she turned and walked back to her car. She told the driver to take her to the office. In the elevator to the 41st floor, she stood perfectly still and breathed very slowly and methodically, the way she breathed when she needed her mind to operate at its sharpest, and she thought about Roland Sterling and his procedural maneuver, and his offshore accounts, and the 2 years of financial records she had identified and never pursued. She had been patient because she believed in working within structures. She had been careful because she understood that the most effective moves were the ones that were unassailable. She had been restrained because she thought there was time. There was no more time. She sat down at her desk at 12:30 in the morning, and she began to work, and this was a different kind of work from any she had done before. Not the work of building something, but the work of dismantling something very carefully and very precisely, so that when it fell in exactly the direction she intended and did not damage anything she was trying to protect. She pulled the financial files. She called an attorney she had used once before for a matter that required complete discretion, a woman named Frances Park, who answered her phone at 12:45 without complaint, because Frances Park had been retained at a level that compensated for calls at 12:45. Victoria laid out what she had: the offshore structures, the transfer pattern she had identified 2 years ago, the timeline that connected Roland's personal account activity with 3 board decisions that had directed Obsidian Core capital toward developments that happened to be adjacent to Roland's private holdings. "How solid is it?" she said. "If the transfers are documented the way you are describing," Frances said, "it is not a civil matter. It is federal. How long to compile? To do it in a way that is bulletproof and admissible. 48 hours if you can give me everything you have by 6 this morning. I will have it to you by 5. She worked through the night. The city outside her windows went through its deep, quiet hours and began to come back to life as 3 became 4 became 5. And she did not stop. She did not sleep. She did not think about anything except the work, because the work was the only tool she had, and she was going to use it with everything she possessed. At 4:58 in the morning, she sent Frances Park everything. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at the architectural model of the Emberwood corridor in its glass case by the window, its clean white surfaces, the smooth plaza where the clock shop did not exist. She thought about a boy checking a fence post every morning for a cocoon. She thought about the expression on his father's face when he turned away. She thought about 48 hours and what had to happen in them, and what it was going to cost her, and whether she was prepared to pay it. She was. She had been preparing to pay it. She understood now, since the moment she walked into a clock shop that smelled of cedarwood and heard rising from the throat of a stranger she had been trying to destroy a lullaby she had been unable to forget for 15 years. She picked up her phone and sent one message to Claire, 3 words: "Clear my calendar." Then she went back to work. The 48 hours that followed were the most precise work Victoria Sterling had ever done in her life. She did not leave the office. Claire brought food that went mostly uneaten and coffee that went mostly cold, and she worked with the focused, unhurried intensity of a person who has stopped trying to manage the outcome and started simply doing the thing that needs to be done. Frances Park called at intervals with updates, each one tightening the case like a mechanism being wound, each piece of documentation slotting into place with the satisfying inevitability of parts that were always meant to fit together. The offshore accounts were the spine of it. Roland had been careful, but careful the way a man is careful when he believes he is the smartest person in every room he enters, which is to say, thorough enough to deter casual scrutiny and not quite thorough enough to withstand the kind of methodical, motivated dismantling that Victoria was capable of when she had nothing left to protect except the thing that mattered most. The pattern was this: Over 7 years, Roland Sterling had used his position on the Obsidian Core board to steer development projects toward parcels adjacent to 3 private holding companies registered in his wife's maiden name in the Cayman Islands. Each time the company moved into a new corridor property, values in the adjacent parcels rose, and Roland's private holdings rose with them. The money was real, the transfers were documented, and the conflict of interest was not disclosed to shareholders at any point during those 7 years. Frances Park described it to Victoria at 2 a.m. on the second night as one of the cleaner cases of self-dealing she had seen in 30 years of corporate law clean, meaning not that it was minor, but that it was unambiguous. The federal exposure is significant, Frances said. Securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, undisclosed conflict of interest across 14 board votes. If this goes to the SEC and the DOJ simultaneously, which it will, he is looking at the end of his professional life at minimum. I know, Victoria said. Victoria. A pause. You understand that when this comes out, the fallout for Obsidian Core is going to be substantial. The share price, the board confidence, the pending projects. I know. You are prepared for that. I have been preparing for it for 48 hours. Yes. She filed the evidence package with Frances at 6 a.m. on the second day. Frances had federal contacts, the kind that came from 30 years of corporate law practiced at the highest level. And the package went to the right desks at the right agencies with the speed and precision of something that had been built to travel fast. Then Victoria did something she had not done in the 2 days since she left Emberwood. She stopped working. She sat in her chair and looked at the city in the early light and let herself feel the weight of what she had just set in motion. The company her father had built. The name on the tower. The 41st floor with its pale ash furniture and its engineered silence, and the architectural model of the Emberwood corridor and its glass case, the clean white surfaces, the smooth plaza. She got up and walked to the model. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up the glass case and set it carefully on the floor in the corner of the office facing the wall. She called the company's head of legal affairs at 7 and told him to prepare 2 documents. The first was a petition for Heritage District designation for the Emberwood corridor under the state's cultural preservation statutes to be filed with the City Planning Commission that morning. The second was her resignation letter. The legal head was quiet for a moment. Both documents, he said, making sure he had heard correctly. Both documents, Victoria confirmed. The Heritage filing first. I need it ready before the shareholder meeting. The emergency meeting is at 10. I know, I called it. She had called the emergency shareholder meeting at midnight, citing material undisclosed information affecting board governance, which was the specific trigger language that legally compelled attendance. By 7 a.m, every major shareholder and all 12 board members had confirmed. Roland had confirmed too because he had no choice, and because he did not yet know exactly what she had. Only that she had something, and the particular confidence of a man who believes his structures are impenetrable had not yet fully resolved itself into alarm. It resolved at 9:47. That was when Frances Park's federal contacts made their first visible move, which was a call to Roland Sterling's personal attorney, the kind of call that is always made before the formal process begins, a professional courtesy, a chance to understand the terrain. Roland's attorney called Roland at 9:47, and Victoria, sitting in the conference room reviewing her presentation materials, watched through the glass wall as Roland Sterling, across the hall, in his own office, received a phone call that changed the color of his face. He looked across the hall at her. She looked back at him. She did not smile. She did not perform anything. She simply held his gaze with the steady, clear attention of a woman who has spent 48 hours building something precise and is now prepared to use it. He looked away first. The shareholder meeting convened at 10. The boardroom was full. In a way it was rarely full. Every seat occupied the room, carrying the particular electric tension of people who knew something significant was happening but did not yet know its shape. Roland was at his usual seat at the far end of the table. He had reassembled his composure, the silver-haired boardroom authority, the smooth confidence of 35 years. But it had the quality of something that had been reassembled in a hurry and was not sitting quite right. Victoria stood at the head of the table. She did not waste time on preamble. I have called this meeting, she said, to address a governance matter of material significance to this company and its shareholders. I am going to present documented evidence of a pattern of self-dealing and undisclosed conflict of interest spanning 7 years and 14 board votes conducted by a sitting board member in direct violation of his fiduciary obligations and in potential violation of federal securities law. The room changed. It changed the way a room changes when something that was theoretical becomes actual, a physical shift. People sitting differently in their chairs, the temperature of attention becoming something sharper and less comfortable. Roland spoke. Victoria, I think we should consider the appropriate forum for. The appropriate forum, she said without looking at him, is this one. These are your shareholders. This is their company. They have a right to know what has been done with it. She presented the evidence. She had built it the way she built every presentation, with the clarity and sequencing of someone who understood that the most powerful argument is one that does not need to be argued, only shown. The offshore accounts, the holding companies, the 14 board votes, the property value timelines, the transfer records. Each element placed where it needed to be, each connection made visible, the whole structure assembled in the room with the same patience and precision that Elias Thorne used to assemble a clock mechanism piece by piece until the shape of the thing was undeniable. When she finished, the room was completely silent. Roland Sterling looked at the table in front of him. He was still composed technically the way a building is still standing, technically when the structural supports have been removed. His attorney, sitting against the wall, was already on his phone. One of the senior shareholders, a woman named Patricia Howe, who had been on the Obsidian Core board for 12 years and had the reputation of the most reliably rational voice in the room, spoke first. What are you proposing? Patricia said. 2 things, Victoria said. First, that the board authorize the immediate filing of the Emberwood Heritage District petition with the City Planning Commission converting the corridor to a government-protected cultural preservation zone. I have the legal documentation ready. Under the state's heritage statutes, the designation is defensible. It eliminates the corridor as a development asset, and it positions the company as a leader in urban preservation, which is frankly a more valuable brand position in the current market than another mixed-use tower. She paused. Our legal team has modeled the tax benefit of the heritage conversion. It is not insignificant. Patricia looked at the other shareholders. The tax benefit did what tax benefits reliably do in rooms full of people whose primary obligation is financial. It moved the air. And the second thing, Patricia said. Victoria reached into the folder in front of her and produced a single sheet of paper, which she slid across the table with the same unhurried care with which she set down everything that mattered. My resignation, she said, effective at the close of this meeting. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the one after the evidence presentation. That silence had been the silence of people absorbing information. This was the silence of people absorbing a choice, a voluntary, deliberate, eyes-open choice made by a person who understood exactly what she was giving up. Victorious, Patricia said, that is not necessary. The governance issue is with Roland, not with your leadership. I know, Victoria said. The resignation is not a consequence. It is a decision. I have been running this company in the direction it was built to go, and that direction is not the one I want to travel anymore. She looked around the table at all the faces she had been sitting across from for 10 years, at the room she had walked into more times than she could count, with the absolute certainty of someone who belonged there. I am very good at what I do here, but I think I can be better at something else somewhere else, and I have been knowing that for longer than I admitted to myself. Roland looked up. His composure had finished its collapse somewhere during the evidence presentation, and what was left on his face was not the anger of a powerful man being challenged, but the more diminished expression of a man who has been seen clearly and found insufficient. You're making a mistake, he said. His voice was quiet, the boardroom resonance gone out of it. Everything you have, everything you built, it came from this company, from this family. Victoria looked at her uncle for a moment. I know, she said, and I am grateful for what was genuinely given. But I have been paying for it at a rate that you set without telling me what the price was. She picked up her pen. She signed the resignation letter with the clean, decisive signature of a woman who has made up her mind completely. The federal matter will proceed independently of this meeting. I have no ability to stop it, and no intention of trying. She slid the resignation letter to the center of the table. Two security personnel appeared at the boardroom door, accompanied by two men in suits who were not Obsidian Core employees and whose presence had the specific, unmistakable quality of federal authority. They had not come for the meeting. They had come because the process that Francis Park had set in motion was now at the stage where it became visible. Roland Sterling stood up slowly. He looked at Victoria once more, a long look, and she looked back at him without flinching and without triumph, because this was not a victory in any way she wanted to celebrate. It was a necessary thing, a removal of something rotten from something she had been trying to protect, and the feeling of it was not satisfaction, but a kind of exhausted, clear-eyed relief. He left the boardroom flanked by the federal agents. Patricia Howe called a procedural vote on the heritage designation filing within 4 minutes. It passed with 9 votes in favor and 1 abstention. The legal team was instructed to file immediately. Victoria walked out of the Obsidian Core boardroom at 11:43 in the morning and did not look back. She stood in the elevator and watched the floor numbers descend and thought about nothing except the street she was going to drive to and the shop door she was going to have to find the courage to open, and the fact that she did not know what was on the other side of it, but was going to find out anyway. She drove to Emberwood. The northern edge of the corridor where the equipment had worked on Thursday night showed the marks of it. A section of the old meeting hall's facade had been partially taken down before the machines were stopped. It stood in the morning light like a sentence that had not been finished, the exposed brick raw and unweathered, the interior visible through the gap. Someone had already put up a temporary barrier and a handwritten sign on it. "We are still here." Victoria stopped the car and got out and stood in front of that sign for a moment. The street around her was its ordinary daytime self. The barber shop opened the flower cart out, an old woman watering the dahlias in the buckets by her door. A few people recognized Victoria, and there was a moment, a brief suspended moment, where she felt the weight of what her name had meant to this street, and she did not look away from it. She let it be what it was. Then she walked to Thorn and Son. The door was unlocked. The bell rang when she pushed it, the same bright, clear note, and the clocks breathed around her, and the smell of the shop cedar wood and oil polish and old warm wood wrapped itself around her the way it always did, immediate and complete. Elias was at his workbench. He was sanding a table, an oak table, with the deep golden color of old growth wood, working with the long, even strokes of someone for whom the rhythm of the work was as natural as breathing. He looked up when she came in. He did not speak. She did not speak either, not immediately. She stood in the middle of the shop and looked at him, and let the silence be what it was, which was not comfortable, but was honest, and honest was the only currency she had left. "The heritage designation petition was filed at 11 this morning," she said. "The board voted in favor. Under the state statutes, the filing triggers an automatic development moratorium on the corridor for the duration of the review, which is a minimum of 18 months. The legal team expects the designation to be approved. The tax benefit structure makes it attractive enough that the company has genuine incentive to maintain it." She paused. "Emberwood is protected. Not as a favor, not as a concession, as a legal fact." Elias set down the sanding block. He looked at her with the steady, careful attention she had come to understand was simply how he looked at everything. Not guarded, not warm, just present and honest and entirely focused. "And Roland," he said, "is no longer with the company. The federal matter is out of my hands and is proceeding as it should." "And you?" She reached into her jacket and produced the copy of her resignation letter, which she had taken from the boardroom because it was hers, and she wanted to keep it not as a trophy, but as a document of a decision she was proud of. "I resigned this morning," she said, "at the close of the shareholder meeting." Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, something more like the expression of a man who had not entirely allowed himself to expect something and is now recalibrating in real time. "You gave up the company," he said. "I gave up a company," she said. "There's only one of those. There is also only one of this street, and only one of this shop, and only one 7-year-old boy who checks a fence post every morning for a butterfly that has not arrived yet." She looked at him directly. "I could not protect all of those things from inside that building. I chose which ones mattered more." The clocks ticked around them. From upstairs came the sound of small feet, the particular pattern of a child who is moving quickly towards something he wants. Leo appeared at the top of the stairs and looked down into the shop, and saw Victoria standing there, and his face did the thing that children's faces do when they feel something uncomplicated and good. It simply opened. "You came back," he said. "I came back," she said. He came down the stairs at a speed that made Elias say his name once quietly, the way parents say a child's name when they are 1 second away from watching them fall, and Leo arrived at the bottom with his momentum intact and his dignity uncompromised and crossed the shop to stand in front of her. "The cocoon," he said, with the urgency of someone reporting breaking news. "It is different today. It has a line around the middle. Dad said that might mean something is happening." "That means it is almost ready," Victoria said. "How long?" "A few days, maybe less." She crouched down so she was at his level. "Do you want me to come and look at it with you?" Leo considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old for whom an invitation to share a scientific observation was a matter requiring genuine deliberation. "Yes," he said, "but you have to be quiet when we look at it. Dad says if you make a lot of noise around things that are becoming something new, they get confused." Victoria looked at him for a moment. "I can be quiet," she said. Leo nodded satisfied and went to find his shoes. Victoria stood up and looked at Elias. He had come around from behind the workbench while Leo was talking, and he was standing closer than he usually stood, close enough that she could smell the cedar and the sawdust and the honest, particular warmth of a man who worked with his hands and his whole attention every day of his life. He looked at her face the way he looked at clock mechanisms, with the patient, thorough attention of someone reading something real. "What are you going to do?" he said, "without the company?" "I have been thinking about that," she said. "There are a lot of neighborhoods like Emberwood, a lot of streets full of people who do not have anyone who understands both the legal architecture and the development pressure well enough to stand between them and the machines." She met his eyes. "I am very good at knowing how those machines work. I built some of them. I think I can use that knowledge to stop them instead." "An office," he said. "A small one. Something with a door that opens onto a street that smells like real life." She glanced around the shop. "I was thinking about the space above the bookbinder. I asked Mrs. Marchetti this morning, and she said the landlord has been looking for a tenant for 3 months. Elias looked at her for a long time. "You asked Mrs. Marchetti before you came here," he said. "I wanted to have something real to say, not a feeling, something actual." He was quiet. "Elias," she said, "I am not asking for anything you are not prepared to give. I am not asking for forgiveness on a timeline. I am not asking for anything except." She paused, and for the first time in the entire conversation, for the first time in a very long time, she let her voice be what it actually was, which was uncertain and genuine and not performing anything. "Except the chance to be a person in this place, on this street, near this shop. I want to learn how to be that person. I do not know how yet, but I think I can, if." She stopped. Leo appeared at the door to the back room with his shoes on the wrong feet, which he had not noticed. "I am ready," he announced. Elias looked at his son. He looked at the wrong feet shoes with the expression of a father who has learned to choose his battles. He looked back at Victoria. "Your shoes are on the wrong feet," he told Leo, not looking away from Victoria. "They feel fine," Leo said. "They will not feel fine in 10 minutes. Leo looked down, assessed the situation, and sat on the floor to make corrections with the unhurried pragmatism of a child who is secure enough in his world to deal with small reversals without drama. Elias reached out and took Victoria's hand. Not a grand gesture, not a declaration. He took her hand the way you take the hand of someone you have decided to stop watching from a careful distance and start walking next to quietly and without announcement, simply because that is the direction you are going. Victoria looked at his hand around hers. She thought about grabbing that hand in the dark of a burning car 15 years ago, the raised texture of the scar under her fingers, the voice that said, "I have got you," and meant it completely. She thought about how long she had been trying to repay something that was never meant to be a debt. She thought about what it felt like to simply receive something without a transaction, without a framework, without the architecture of exchange that she had built around every relationship she had ever tried to have with another person. She held on. The three of them walked out of the shop into the morning, Leo leading with the authority of a person who knows exactly where he is going. His shoes now on the correct feet, his face already turned toward the fence at the end of the street where a cocoon had been changing in the quiet and the ordinary light of ordinary days. The street was alive around them. Mrs. Marchetti's bakery had its door open, and the smell of something warm and sweet was drifting out onto the sidewalk. Hal Briggs was opening his shop across the way, the shoe repair sign swinging gently in the morning air. The old man with the chess set was already at his folding table arranging his pieces with the patient ritual of a person for whom the day's first move is a sacred thing. The machines were gone. The petition was filed. The street was still here. Leo reached the fence and stopped and pointed with one small, serious finger at the cocoon attached to the third post from the left, and all three of them stood in the morning light and looked at it, a small, perfect, unremarkable thing in the process of becoming something it had always been going to become, taking exactly as long as it needed to take. "The line is bigger than yesterday, Miss," Leo said in the reverent half-whisper he had decided was appropriate for cocoon observation. "Yes," Elias said. "It is." "How does it know when to come out?" Leo asked. Elias looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at the cocoon. "It comes out," she said, "when it has finished becoming what it is inside, when it has done all the work it needed to do in the dark, and it is ready to find out what it looks like in the light." Leo absorbed this. "That sounds scary," he said. "It probably is," Victoria said. "The first few seconds. And then," she looked at the street around her, at the bakery and the barber shop and the bookbinder and the narrow two-story building that smelled of cedarwood and thyme, at the hand still holding hers. "And then," she said, "it turns out you had wings the whole time." 1 year later, the butterfly on the fence was long gone, having departed on its own schedule with no ceremony and no announcement, the empty cocoon left behind like a small transparent shed skin. Leo had kept it in a jar on his windowsill for 2 months before deciding it belonged back outside, and he had returned it to the fence post with the same serious deliberateness with which he approached all consequential decisions. The Emberwood Heritage District designation had been approved 8 months after the petition was filed on a Thursday morning in late autumn, with a brief ceremony at the neighborhood community center, rebuilt. Now its facade restored the exposed brick covered over with new material that had been chosen to match the old as closely as possible. Mrs. Marchetti had brought enough sfogliatelle for everyone, which was a significant quantity. Hal Briggs had worn his best shoes, which he had repaired himself, and which were objectively the best maintained shoes in the room. Victoria had stood at the back of the room during the ceremony. She had not spoken. She was there as a neighbor, not as the architect of the legal mechanism, and the distinction mattered to her in a way she could not have articulated 18 months ago and now found completely natural. The office above the bookbinder had a door that opened onto the street and a window that let in the morning light and a small hand-painted sign that said Sterling Legal and Architectural Aid Free Consultations by Appointment. The waiting list for consultations was currently 6 weeks long and growing, because it turned out that there were a great many Emberwoods and a great many people who needed someone who understood how the machines worked. Claire had left Obsidian Core and joined her 3 months in because she had lasted 11 months as Victoria's assistant, and was therefore the longest-serving person in that role in the company's history, and had concluded that this qualified her to follow whatever direction Victoria was pointing. On a Saturday morning in the late spring that marked 1 year since the board meeting, Victoria was in the back of the office finishing a legal brief for a neighborhood association in the warehouse district when she heard the bell above the office door ring, and then Leo's voice, and then the sound of Elias telling Leo to take his backpack off before he knocked something over. She closed her laptop. She pulled on her jacket, the simple one cotton and worn soft at the elbows, and checked her reflection once in the small mirror by the door, and saw a woman with a smudge of something on her cheek, ink, or perhaps paint, from the building diagram she had been sketching that morning and did not wipe it off. She walked out into the front of the office where Leo was already investigating the bookshelf she kept for him, selecting and rejecting titles with the authority of a seasoned critic. And Elias was standing by the window in the morning light, looking at the street, and he turned when she came in with the particular quality of attention she had come to understand was entirely specific to her. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced the key to the office, a simple brass key on a simple ring, and she tossed it to him, an easy underhand toss, and he caught it without looking, the reflex of a man who works with his hands and catches things without drama. He looked at the key. He looked at her face. "My clock is acting up again," she said. "The carriage clock, the mainspring." She met his eyes, and she was smiling the particular smile of a person who has finally, after a very long time, arrived somewhere they did not know they were looking for. "I think I need a lifetime warranty." Elias turned the key over in his hand once. He looked at her with those dark walnut eyes that had seen her clearly from the very first day, the eyes of a man who worked with his whole attention and never looked at anything or anyone with less than complete honesty. He stepped forward. He took her hand, the unadorned hand, no rings, no watch, just her hand, and he held it the way he held everything, with the certain careful grip of a craftsman who knows the weight and value of what he is holding. "That is a very expensive warranty," he said. "It will cost you the rest of your life." Outside on the street, the morning was doing what mornings in Emberwood always did, which was proceeding with the warm, unhurried abundance of a place that had survived the things that were meant to end it and had come out the other side still entirely itself. The bakery door was open. The chess game was in progress. The clocks in the shop next door were ticking, all of them, dozens of quiet, measured heartbeats, keeping time for a street that had always known its own worth. Victoria Sterling looked at the man holding her hand at the key between them at the life on the other side of the window, ordinary and irreplaceable and entirely real. "I know," she said. "Are you sure?" She was already sure. She had been sure since a rainy night and a wooden basin and a Band-Aid with superheroes on it and a wool blanket that smelled of sun and cedar. She had been sure since the moment she understood that the most valuable thing she had ever been given was not a company or a title or a corner office on the 41st floor, but a hand reaching through the dark toward her, asking nothing except that she take it. She had been sure for a long time. "Ask me something harder," she said. And Elias Thorne, the man who fixed broken things and kept time and sang old songs to frighten people in the dark, smiled the way he smiled when something worked the way it was always supposed to work, complete and warm and without any reservation at all. And the clocks kept ticking, and the street kept living, and that was enough. That was in every way that mattered exactly enough.